I'd like to welcome you to Stockholm and to the Ratio Research Institute. I'm Nils Karlson, and I have the honor and great pleasure to introduce to you all here Paul Romer. Paul Romer is well known. He's currently a professor at Stockholm School of Business at NYU, where he is also director of the Urbanization Project. In a couple of weeks, he will become the Chief Economist of the World Bank. And the reason he's here in Stockholm is that he's given the yearly Eli F. Heckscher lecture at the Stockholm School of Economics. And the theme for this lecture is short-run shocks and long-run pessimism. And Paul,
yes,
why did you choose this theme for your lecture?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for inviting me to the Heckscher lecture, because Heckscher's a kind of a model of how I think economists should kind of live their lives, where they both use theory but pay attention to evidence, including history. So I chose this title, because there was a story I wanted to tell about what I experienced in the early 1980s, and there's a parallel between that time and the current time. In each case, we had come through a period of some shocks, like high inflation then, the financial crisis, the debt crisis here. And those short-run shocks turned people very pessimistic about long-run prospects. But I think that turn is unfounded. There's actually very strong reasons to be optimistic about the long run. And as long as we take the right responses to the short-run shocks, we should actually be optimistic about the future.
So why should we be optimistic? I mean, most people around the world are facing all these problems now.
Right.
And,
well, many people are uncomfortable when I say you should be optimistic. And I think that's because they worry that it will induce complacency. So I don't mean optimistic in the sense of just do nothing, it will all turn out okay. But I mean optimism in the sense that if we get busy right now, take the right actions, things will be better. Now, why is that important? I think when people get too pessimistic, they deny the reality of the situation they're in. They become apathetic. They don't take action. So optimism is, I think, the right spur to take the kinds of actions we should take to avoid, for example, another financial crisis. We should be sure and arrange our financial system so it isn't as likely to produce another crisis like the one we've been through. And then we should focus on some of the things that really have a chance to improve the quality of life all over the world.
if I understand you correctly, your basic idea is that you should be optimistic about reason and the role of ideas.
Yeah.
Because ideas are something that are not rival.
That's right.
Everyone can benefit from good ideas.
Yeah. So there's two dimensions to this optimism. The first is really the history, the kind of perspective of Heckscher, which is that over time, the quality of life for humans, just average standards of living, have been improving at faster and faster rates. And this runs very much counter to the traditional thinking in economics that goes back to Malthus, which says as there's more people, there's less of every physical resource, so somehow things should be getting worse. Now, based on that kind of historical evidence, I started working on models to understand what could offset the scarcity. It's true that there are fewer square meters of land per person now than at any time in the past. How can we still have plenty to eat? And as you say, the answer is that we have discovered new ideas, better ways to produce food from a given amount of land. And once you start to think about the potential for discovering new things, I think it becomes very clear that we can't possibly have found everything that's out there to be discovered. And so there's really almost unlimited capacity to discover new ideas, better things to do.
This would be like the greatest advantage of globalization, of
yes,
interconnectedness, of free trade, of free movement, of everything. Really.
Yeah. If you have an isolated population, they can keep discovering new ideas, but if you connect them to a much larger global population, they can take advantage of not just the things they discover, but the things that everybody else discovers. And everybody else can get the advantage of things they discover.
So new technologies open up new possibilities, and new better ways of organizing our societies can spread within this larger network.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the title should really have been short-run shocks, short-run pessimism, but long-run optimism, perhaps.
Well, the title is my description of how people are interpreting things. It's not my view.
So why do people become overly pessimistic?
Yeah.
And especially in the long run.
Yeah.
You gave some examples from the Club of Rome, and we have other examples.
Yeah.
And it's the same today. People in
Yeah.
the long run become very pessimistic.
It's an interesting question. I think it has partly to do with human psychology. I think we survived because we were always looking for what could go wrong. So, I think we're wired to be a little bit like that. And it takes conscious thought to overturn those innate, I think, fears that we have. And that's really what I see my role
It's a
as.
cognitive bias or something.
I think there probably is a bias towards pessimism,
Yeah.
And this is easier to see when we look back at the long-run fears of the 80s. Right now, we don't know for sure what's going to happen in the next 20 years. But you look back to the 1980s, well, for example, there was a very prominent book saying that we would see millions, hundreds of millions of people dying in the 1980s and 1990s because of starvation. We couldn't possibly have enough food. And not only was that false, worldwide, life expectancy has gone up by 7 years in this time interval. But the fear actually even got the problem wrong. Instead of not enough food and people are starving, the real problem we're facing now is too much food and too much sugar and diabetes, which is becoming an obesity. Yeah. So the fears, part of what I was saying is that the fears make you stupid, and we need to get an accurate sense of what we should do. We need to stop being afraid and just think carefully about what we face.
Yeah. So this force of ideas, I would like to come back a little bit later to some other current challenges, refugee crisis and so on, debt crisis.
Yep. Yeah.
But you're also troubled, you're concerned about that the wrong ideas may have gone into macroeconomic thinking and how we construct these models when we try to analyze capital markets, financial markets, and so on.
Right. Well, let me lead into that by talking about my part of macroeconomics, which is growth theory, and then I'll relate it to the fluctuations theory. So I had both this look at evidence in the historical past, and then a theory which said, look, as we've got more and more people trying to discover things, we're going to discover things faster. The test of a theory like that is to see, okay, well, did things play out the way you predicted, Professor? And one fact that I didn't mention last night is that as of 1980, there were about 300 million people on Earth who had a telephone line. Yeah. And it was a pretty slow process of acquiring telephones. There are now more than 6 billion people, I think it may be approaching 7 billion, who have a telephone. And of course, that was made possible because we discovered a way to have telephony without having to rely on wires, and also to bypass bureaucratic government organizations, which were in many places in charge of the phone system. So I think we can say that this theory actually made a prediction that was true. Now, in macro, we've had a lot of work on a particular class of models, and the predictions from these models don't match the facts. And so the question is, in science, what you do is you say, okay, it was a nice try. It's no shame in discovering that the model wasn't right. Let's figure out another model.
Yeah, let's reconsider. Yeah.
But the pattern instead has been for people to basically form a kind of a protective group and to become very defensive and very aggressive in promoting their kind of vision, but without paying much attention to the facts. And so I said, and this is harsh language, but I said it's a group that have developed a kind of a dogma that they defend the way a religion would defend its beliefs, and they simply just dismiss or ignore or assume away the facts that we see. So this is, I think, a case not just of scientists who got a wrong answer, but of scientists who stopped being scientists.
So how shall we escape this?
Yeah. Yeah, well,
I think dead end, perhaps, even
Yep.
in macroeconomic thinking. More empirical
Yeah.
research,
Well-
more curiosity, harsher debates.
One of the things that I like about my job is that I get to look at history, I get to think about models, but you also get to talk to people, and you learn things from talking to people. And it's interesting to watch how ideas spread. I gave a talk last January expressing my concerns. Somebody from the Central Bank of Norway was in the audience. He said, "Why don't you come give a talk here at the bank, and let's talk about this issue." As I talked with people in the central bank, I realized that a good way out of this problem is to take the consumers of economic research, like central banks or my future employer, the World Bank, and say to those
policymakers all over.
policymakers, and say to them, you need to be discriminating, vocal customers of research. So if they give you a piece of research which you can put to use, or it helps you understand how to do your job, you should say, that was good, like give it a like or something, a thumbs up. But if it's research which strikes you as just sort of completely wrong-headed, you should say that. And so I think that's really what we need is to get the consumers of macroeconomics to signal to the professors, hey, this stuff was good, and we'd like to learn more about that. This other stuff you're doing, it's just a dead end. And so part of my job at the World Bank will be to get everybody in that mode.
So where should we go? I mean, certain parts of the world, Scandinavia has fairly good growth rates, at least Sweden.
Yeah.
Well, some parts of Asia has picked up again and also have fairly good growth rates. The US has picked up a little bit, but Europe, I would say, is in deep trouble.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things, if you're studying an economy, is that it changes. The circumstances now are different than we've seen before. For example, the demographics of Europe are very different from what they were in the past because of lower fertility, aging populations. One fear is that this demographic change is limiting our ability to grow in Europe. I don't think that's plausible, but it's a hypothesis we should consider. I think that, frankly, part of what we're suffering from is our successes in the 1980s. Another fear everybody had when back then was that inflation would spiral ever higher. And it turns out that central banks, when they convinced everybody they were serious about keeping inflation low, inflation fell.
They did a good job at that time.
We solved that. We solved the problem of increasing inflation. We now have a new problem, which is inflation, which is too low.
Which needs new policies
Yeah.
and perhaps a rethinking of our models.
That's right. So,
And can you indicate in some direction you think we
Well,
should go or possibly could
yeah.
go?
I think one of my messages about behaving like scientists is to be honest with ourselves and with others about how much uncertainty we face. It used to be that if you asked a scientist, how long is this, table, they'd tell you a number. But we realized that's not a good idea. We should tell you both our estimate of how long it is, but also what's our uncertainty, a kind of a confidence range. I think there's much more uncertainty about what would be good policy right now than the economists often indicate. But what that tells you is, in a way, it's good news that there's uncertainty, because the bad news, if you do something wrong, of course, you'll get a bad outcome. But if you do the right thing, it's possible that something much better will emerge than we think, at least better than what we're getting right now. So I think we should be open-minded about what countries could do to speed up the rate of growth. And I think we need to lose this fear that we had in the 70s that, oh, if we grow a little bit too fast, inflation will go spiraling out of control, and we'll be back in the interwar period in Germany.
But
So
if we're a bit more concrete, I mean, we have these negative interest rates in,
Yeah.
in Europe,
Yeah.
and it seems like we're caught in some liquidity trap in the Keynesian way, actually,
Yeah.
where
Yeah. Well,
it doesn't help much.
Yeah. Well,
we also have debt
yeah.
problems in many countries, so there's a big concern that we shouldn't increase public debt.
Sure.
So what should we do?
Well, I think again, if we actually have the confidence to recognize we can actually influence the inflation rate, I think there's two things we should do. The first is we should target an inflation rate that's a little bit higher than the ones we've been getting. So 2%, maybe 3%, because this gives the central banks a little bit more flexibility.
But targeting is one thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what the people who kind of remember the 70s say is, oh, if we go to 3, then it'll be 5, and then it'll be 10. And I don't think that's right. I think they think we can target 2, and it will stay at 2 forever. Why doesn't that also apply to 3? So we should try it. If they're right, we'll change, but we could try that. But the other thing, I think, is that if we recognize that we can independently control the inflation rate, we should be much more aggressive about trying things that might speed up the rate of growth. The old idea was that if you get an economy working at close to capacity, all its resources are fully utilized. Again, we'll get inflation, and that might not be true
By
anymore.
increasing public spending, or
I think this is where I think we need to be willing to experiment. I don't think we know for sure, but I mean, for example, mobilization for wartime is one of the cases where we've seen capacity utilization in an economy increase very quickly,
which is low today.
So one of the things we should say is, okay, what was the good part of mobilizing for war, and then what was the bad part? Let's do more of the good part, but don't do that bad part. So we shouldn't be making tanks and bombs, but we could make things that people want.
Bring up a small thing that I have a personal interest in.
Yeah.
That's investments in human capital, innovation, and so on. We've done a lot of research in this area.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a decreasing marginal utility of further investments.
Yeah.
Or at least that's the kind of more theoretical academic investments in human capital. We have skill shortages all over, mismatch on labor markets and so on. Have you been thinking about this, given your endogenous growth rate?
Yeah, I have. Let me make one more pitch about utilization, and then because I split it in two pieces. One question is, how do we get more capacity? And then the second is, how do we make sure we use what we've already got? On the capacity we've got, the analogy I tried in the talk last night is between, say, the entire Swedish economy and like a Toyota factory in Germany. And what they do at Toyota is run the plant right up at the edge of capacity, with very little room for error, and things break. So instead of trying to avoid having things break, they tried to get right to the edge where things were breaking, because then people could fix those problems. So this whole strategy of lean manufacturing was to solve deep bottlenecks and problems in your systems by uncovering them as problems and then fixing them. So there might be a way to try and set policy for an entire economy to say, let's run it right up on the edge of where there's perceptions of shortages and people are concerned, where do we get enough resources to keep going? And then we'll find ways to produce the same amount with fewer inputs, and that's what we call productivity improvement. So I think that may be the most important challenge at the moment. Now, on increasing
I like
capacity,
that idea, lean policy.
Yeah,
lean policy.
lean. And so this is not the same as, I don't know, like a helicopter drop of money, and it's not necessarily something where you'd want the the government to take, say, a big role in, say, running the factories or something.
It's more about making policies work better, improving things.
Yeah. And there was a period in the 1990s when you saw, in the United States in particular, but also in Britain, I know, we were running at close to capacity. This meant that wages for low-income, low-skilled workers were actually increasing faster than usual because everybody was scrambling to get workers. So it was this kind of lean macro could actually help us solve this problem we worry about income distribution too. So.
What about skills? Very shortly, I will move on.
Oh, you can't get a professor to change his. Let me just say one more thing. And furthermore, in the United States, and I think this must be true in Europe as well, a lot of the potential resources, like the labor, is not counted as unemployed because they're what we call discouraged workers. They're not even looking for a job. No. People often in their late middle ages, in their 50s and their 60s. So a lean economy might not only raise wages for low-skilled workers, but it might get people who would really enjoy the value and the income from a job back into the labor market. So,
but how should we invest in skills if more academic? We have 50-60% of many countries going to universities, which is extremely high levels.
Yeah. Well, sometimes the economists have to be the bearers of bad news, and there's some bad news we need to be honest about in evaluating our educational systems. There was a view before, which is these systems work perfectly well, and we just need to get people to stay in them longer. Just more, what now in kind of a sarcastic way we refer to as seat time. Just get somebody to sit in a seat longer in the educational system, and they'll do better. The evidence now that's emerging is that there's enormous heterogeneity in how effective schools are at giving people valuable skills. And the way we see this is we now measure things. We measure directly what a student learns. So the way to measure human capital is not how many years did you sit in the classroom, but it's, can you add 2 fractions? This is not a very complicated thing to find out about a student. Because there's a lot of people who don't like the bad news that this has produced, there's a lot of backlash against, we don't want testing, we don't want, mandates about what to study, there's a lot of grumbling. But look, if we think students should be able to add fractions, we ought to check and see, are they learning to add fractions? And if we think they ought to be able to read a newspaper article, we should just test and see, did they read and understand a newspaper article? When you do those tests, the results are pretty discouraging. A lot of people go through the educational system and don't acquire those skills. So I think we need to, frankly,
a broader discussion about what kind of skills really are.
Yeah, well, it is worth asking.
How do we transfer them?
Do people actually need to add fractions? I mean, that's a reasonable question. Because basically, on the job, nobody's going to add fractions. You're going to open up a piece of software that does it for you. But there's probably a mental discipline that comes from doing this and a preparation for other kinds of math. But it's a reasonable question to ask, what skills should people acquire? But as we come to a consensus about that, then what we should do is ask, okay, is the school doing a good job of teaching those skills? And how could we do a better job? So I've grown increasingly skeptical about the response that for many years economists were pushing, which is get people to stay in school longer, like get a college degree, get everybody into the school system. And I think one of my ambitions for the bank is that we help families, citizens all over the world get more information about what young people are learning in school, and then have the knowledge to start working on improving their school systems.
Very, very interesting, I think. We have other very important challenges, of course, and we won't have time to discuss them all here, but it's everything from handling a future financial crisis coming up, given these policy mistakes that goes on. We have refugee crises, we have environmental crises, global warming, and so on. And you're basically an optimist.
Right.
That we have the ability to create, develop new ideas that will, in fact, not only be ideas, but they will be implemented by policymakers. And that's a challenge, of course.
Sure.
Well, now in your new role, you have, I think, the possibility to really make influence here.
There's an episode from history that I like to invoke in this context. It was, I think it was Kepler, but when people were first starting to understand the solar system, I may have it wrong which scientist it was, but some scientist had a theory that there have to be 5 planets because there are 5 platonic solids. These are these regular shapes, like a tetrahedron and a square. There's only 5 of those, so there have to be 5 planets. You know, people could have all kinds of theories, but at the end of the day, you just go out and count the planets. And there's more than 5 planets. So, forget the damn theory. It's just, the facts are what matter. So
that's an interesting illustration of your critique of mathiness.
That's right. Yeah.
If you get stuck into the math world.
So
which is
people have a theory that, for example, to protect the planet from global warming, we have to radically reduce our quality of life. This is the only way to save the planet. Okay, well, that's a theory, but what evidence could we look at and see if that was right? We faced a comparable challenge when we realized that some chemicals that we produced and emitted were eroding the ozone layer, which was going to expose the surface of the Earth to more ultraviolet radiation. At the time, there was enormous fear that we'd have to give up everything we like about modern life just to protect the ozone layer. But once we had governments that said, you can't emit these dangerous chemicals anymore, you got to do something else. It actually turned out to be very easy to find other ways to do things. So I think there's a theory that solving global warming is going to be, it's going to force us to all give up all the things we like. I just think it won't be true. Once we actually set about trying to do it, it'll turn out to be much easier than anybody thinks.
So we have a role here to identify the problems, analyze them correctly, make governments realize that you have to put priorities on this and then.
And yet the government needs to take an action. Like in the case of the chemicals for the ozone hole, they said you can't keep producing those and emitting them. But what that does is unleash all kinds of innovation and creativity in the private sector. So I think our approach on producing energy with less carbon should be, in the same sense, have the government set the incentives, probably with a tax which will be increasing over time. So people know, boy, if I can find a low carbon energy source, I could probably make a bunch of money. So if the governments can create the incentives and then just trust the cleverness and problem-solving ability of people, I think everybody's going to be surprised at how easy this problem will be to address.
I really find this optimism very encouraging and very interesting. I think the world needs this right now.
Right. Yeah.
We're in a situation where, at least in Europe, perhaps in the US, some other parts of the world, we see a rise of populist movements, of protectionist ideas, and so on. And your big message is that free trade, urbanization, interconnectedness, that's our chance. That's how we can find the good ideas, develop the new policies, and so on that will benefit everyone.
Right.
And
but let me take the free trade piece and split it into 2 pieces. So one is, think about the smartphone. There was a huge amount of design work that went into the device and into the software that ran that device. That's the kind of idea that you'd like to spread all over the world, as it has. So you want continued diffusion of ideas like that. Now, Apple, who was the early innovator in this, manufactured many of its smartphones in China, re-imported them back into the United States. Because of political pressure, we may actually see some limits on how much more we can do of, say, manufacturing in the developing world and importing into rich countries. That would be a mistake, I think, but I think it might happen. Even if, for example, Apple had to make some iPhones in the United States and sell them in the United States, make others in Europe, sell them in Europe, make others in India, sell them in India, that wouldn't be such a tragedy. What's really important is that a good idea like this can be available to consumers all over the world, and then copied and improved, or differentiated by another firm like Samsung. So it's really the global diffusion and improvement of ideas that we want to be sure to protect.
The political challenge, of course, is now when we have this rapid change, Schumpeterian creative destruction, that these new technologies, in an increasing pace, it seems, will affect us.
Right.
The electorate
right.
may be more short-sighted than a senior economist.
Well, one of my little sayings is that everybody wants growth and nobody wants change. So, you kind of...
In the end, we all benefit from change.
Yeah, I think you have to confront people with
new
the reality.
technologies, new ideas.
Yeah, if you want growth, you got to accommodate a little bit of change. But I think one of the things that is a good idea is listen to people who are afraid of change. See what they're afraid of. For example, in the United States, part of what people were afraid of about losing a job is they'd lose access to health care. So we took some steps that have been effective. We could do more that make sure that everybody will have access to health care, even if they lose a job or change jobs. So I think it's even as you tell people, look, the change won't be quite as bad as you think, you still have to be ready to listen and say, okay, well, tell me, what's the part of change that really troubles you or you have the greatest fears about? And then let's see if we can help you protect you from those fears. So I think we have to be empathetic, but still try and be persuasive about it. Historically, we've really all benefited enormously from change, and we can still get those benefits going forward.
I think that's a great message to end this conversation with.
Well,
Thank
good.
you very much, Paul.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.